Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
The Dogman entranced my sister. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story that I don't think would fit on anyone's channel but yours. I mean, no offense, but if I were willing to attach my name to this, I might have given it to Vic Cundiff. But since I'm doing this anonymously, you're the channel that seems to get all the encounters where dogmen and human women have some kind of weird interaction that's just different from how they interact with human males. There was a dogman who terrorized my family one weekend that we spent at our dad's boss's cabin in the West Virginia woods that seemed, for whatever reason, to become fixated on my creepy and ugly older sister. I'm joking when I call her that. Well, half joking, but back then I would say those words and mean them literally. She was almost 9 years older than I was, and although my name is Axel, she used to always call me Accident. So, if you asked me at that time, I would have told you that she was the accident. For that reason, let's call her Misty, which in this case can be short for mistake. By the way, she and I don't really hate each other anymore, now that we're both adults, but we genuinely disliked each other years ago when the story took place. In fact, when she first told us she saw a wolf watching her in the woods while she was sunbathing, I laughed, and I did not believe her. You would think that my parents might have been concerned about a report of a wolf roaming around in broad daylight outside the cabin, but I don't think they believed her either. She was kind of dramatic in those days, and I think we thought she was making it up, or maybe she saw a German shepherd and was exaggerating. A while later, when it was lunchtime, my mother made me walk out into the woods to the rock in the clearing that my sister was sunning herself on. I reached the clearing and was about to call to Misty when the words got stuck in my throat. I saw the wolf that she had been talking about. It was just inside the shadow of the woodline, and it was staring at my sister. Then it turned and looked directly at me, and I saw the legendary eye shine of a certain cryptid for the first time in my life. It suddenly rose into the air and showed itself to be a 6.5, 7 foot tall creature. This confused me so much that I almost lost my balance. My sister was asking me what I was spazzing out about as I watched that wolf stand up, looking like a man much taller than my father, turn and walk off at a diagonal to some destination inside the forest. I couldn't speak, and so Misty mocked me. I managed to get out. The lunch was happening at the cabin. Then I ran back there, thoroughly shaken up. I told everyone what I had seen. The wolf that Misty saw was real, but it wasn't a wolf. It was a werewolf. My sister laughed. My father called me a liar. I burst into tears, and Dad called me names that are no longer fashionable to say in public. Then my mother was cradling me and shouting at my father, but nobody was realizing that I wasn't being dramatic. I was genuinely telling them that I had actually seen a wolf stand up and walk away like a man. I had seen a real-life werewolf-type creature, and it had shaken me up pretty badly. I had the shivers and a bit of paranoia as every little sound made me jump and look over my shoulder. And then each time that would happen, my father would get furious at me and order me to act like a man. My mother would remind him that I was not a man, I was a boy, and he would tell her that's what I'd always stay, as long as she kept coddling me. I started to drift into my own world every time they would shout. It was less painful if I didn't listen to anything they said. Then it was almost like it hadn't happened. And as I was blocking out their argument, I happened to look over at one of the side windows of the cabin, and my heart jumped in my chest. There outside that window, I saw some very familiar eye shine. Once again, The same strange wolf was staring at my stupid sister. This time it was fogging up the glass. It was that close to the window pane itself. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I realized there was no place to run to. Instead, I just looked at my sister, getting her to glare back and ask me what my major malfunction was. I pointed to the window, and then she screamed, making my mother spill her wine all over herself and making my dad throw his knife across the room in surprise. Of course, by the time they looked at the window, the Dogman had already run away. But Dad got up and ran outside to see if he could see what was going on. He came back about a full minute later, and he said he saw a big man in a black and silver leotard run away. But when he looked at the guy's footprints in the mud, they looked like huge paw prints. He said the feet were just as large as his, but they were round and looked like a giant dog paw, not a human foot. He speculated at first that it might be a crazy man wearing boots that left dog prints. And he began cleaning his boss's old hunting rifle in case there would be a reason to use it later that Friday night or the next night on Saturday if we did decide to stay for the full weekend as originally planned. Dad loaded it up and kept it nearby. I told my parents again what I had seen in the forest earlier, and this time at least my father paid attention to me. He asked me if the guy was as tall as he was, and I told him that Dogman was taller. We had a neighbor who was I think 6'3" or 6'4" in those days, and I told my dad that I thought the Dogman was maybe even a bit taller than that guy. Dad looked unhappy at my answer, but he admitted that the figure he saw retreating into the woods was probably just a few inches shy of 7 feet. We were just confirming each other's sightings. My mother was annoyed at all this and asked if we shouldn't pack up and go home. My father told her that wolves exist in forests, so do bears, so do hunters. Any of those things could hurt us, and so going in the woods is always going to be dangerous. But if we hadn't noticed the big upright walking wolf, we wouldn't be talking about going home. Would we leave if we saw a bear? I didn't like to disagree with my dad, but I told him that werewolf Dogman seemed to have some kind of interest in ugly girls, because it seemed to be Misty who kept him coming back around. So we ate dinner and played a board game, and things felt a little more normal after that. In the middle of the night, my sister woke up screaming. But it had nothing to do with the Dogman. It was just a weird problem she had for some years there, with bad nightmares. I think they call them night terrors, like that great YouTube channel. So we all got up and ran around, thinking that the Dogman had broken in or something. But it was a false alarm. And then we all shakily laid back down and tried to get some sleep before the sun was back up in the sky. On the second day, Dad forbade any of us from leaving his range of vision, so Misty was banned from sunning herself in that clearing in the woods. She set up a folding chair and a footrest, then commenced complaining about how uncomfortable she was, to bother Dad. Considering the alternative was to lay on a rock, I thought she was kind of being a jerk about it. The thing is, I was really scared of that big old Dogman, and she seemed to only get scared when she was actually seeing it. Out of sight, out of mind, I guess. But to me, I was fully aware that the Dogman could be anywhere, and I was only outside because I had been ordered to be, and because the three of them were all with me in that space. I still have nightmares that take place on that bright sunny day, with the Dogman lurking just out of sight, and me being the only one who understands. Those are the scariest dreams I have, because they feel so real. It's just exactly like being back there, and I can assure you that I would never want to go back there. Not willingly. We had burgers cooked over a fire for lunch, and I suppose that was just as appealing to the Dogman as my sister was, because as my dad napped after our meal, I noticed the Dogman in the woods. He was somewhat low to the ground, so he was either down on all fours or else squatting. All you could really see was his silver and black face, with his tall wolf ears, and his intense amber glowing eyes peering out of the darkness into our world. When my mother gasped, I knew she had finally seen the beast. Well, she saw, but she did not understand. "What a handsome guy," she cooed. "Look at those intelligent and thoughtful eyes," she enthused. I thought she was crazy, and I explained to her that she was looking at a monster man, not a cute puppy dog. "That's no puppy dog," she corrected me. "That's a stately and beautiful adult dog. I'm going to bring him a hamburger and make friends with him." She instantly started preparing a paper plate with a burger to walk over to an actual real-life upright walking canid. That's how sweet and trusting my mom was. The more I told her that Dogman was dangerous, the more mom words she would use like pish-tosh, and the less she would listen to me. Mom took her paper plate of meat and began walking over to the Dogman, talking baby talk in a soothing manner. I ran to my dad to wake him up, which took some time. When I finally succeeded in getting his eyes open, we both looked over and watched Mom presenting the plate of burger meat to the dog face peering out from between trees and bushes. And as she drew close, the dog suddenly and unexpectedly rose straight up in the air, surprising my mom so much that she almost fell over backward. Grabbing his boss's rifle, Dad made a run, calling out to Mom, and the three of us watched that almost 7-foot-tall dog-headed animal man as it turned and walked back into the woods. My sister had her eyes shut, listening to her bad music on her Walkman, which should set the date when this took place. When were Walkmen around? It played cassette tapes, so we're talking some time ago. I mean, I had a cell phone by the time I was 16, so I must have still been pretty young when this all happened. There were no cell phones yet. Not in my family, at least. If someone was carrying a little rectangular box that they listened to back then, it was a Walkman. Or a knockoff of a Walkman. Short version, Misty missed that appearance of the Dogman. So I thought it might be a good idea to pack up and get out of there without having to risk spending another overnight out in those creepy woods. My father would get visibly annoyed each time I'd suggest this, though, and he'd remind me that we saw the Dogman walk away. "It got up and left," he groaned at me. "What part of that is too difficult for you to understand?" Since I had seen the Dogman leave multiple times already, I knew that the main point was not his leaving, but the fact that he might be back at any time and with no warning. The chances of him really having gone away this time seemed to me to fall between unlikely and impossible, so I just wanted to go. My dad had brought us out there to spend 2 nights in the forest, and he wasn't going to change those plans without being forced to. Well, of course the Dogman returned as Mom prepared us dinner. He was watching from the woods with those eyes that seemed so intelligent. I knew he couldn't actually be intelligent because he kept staring at my sister, but he did look like there was a lot going on behind those retinas. This was an intimidating monster, yet at the same time, he would have this expression on his face that sometimes resembled a wise professor, and other times some sort of poet or philosopher. He did not make savage expressions. He did not bare his teeth at us or make threatening movements. But make no mistake about it, we were not in charge of that situation. The Dogman was. It was on that second night that I noticed Misty staring right back at the Dogman through the window. The two of them looked like there was an invisible cord connecting their eyes, as if neither one could have looked away, even if they had wanted to. I tried talking to Misty, but she wouldn't even call me hurtful names or belittle me in any way, so I knew there was something wrong with her. Neither of my parents seemed to care. I guess they were grateful that at least one of us was being quiet for a change. My mother kept uttering how handsome the Dogman was, how stately and majestic a creature, and all this nonsense that started making my father really angry. Eventually, He even took off his wedding ring, and he asked her if she wanted to go put it on the Dogman's paw. Mom got really embarrassed. She insisted she hadn't meant to gush so much about this monster who might eat all of us if we weren't careful. She was acting like he was a pop star or a movie star, but he was an upright bipedal carnivore or omnivore, not a matinee idol or a media influencer. I found it bizarre the effect that the creature had on my mother. Now, my sister I thought of as an idiot, but I had expected more from the matriarch of our clan. Dad started to get fed up with this entire situation, and he announced we weren't sleeping there one night longer. We were commanded to pack up and turn everything in the cabin off, which we did. Then Dad ran out front by himself, screaming horrible things at the Dogman who was in those trees, staring forward with those glowing yellowish orange eyes. Dad was freaking out, putting on a full rage display. Then he fired a shot maybe a foot above that creature's head, and went back to ranting some more. Calmly, in an almost bored fashion, the canine stood back up to its human-like bipedal two-legged standing position. It sighed, as though bored with my father, then turned and walked, gracefully, back into the woods. We ran to the car and packed ourselves in as fast as we could, barely getting our seatbelts on before the car took off down the dark road back to the highway. I don't remember where he caught up to us, but I remember the Dogman running alongside our car on a very dark road, and I remember how scared I was. This was much worse than seeing it out the windows of the cabin. This was seeing the thing about 1 or 2 feet away. I don't know how fast my father was driving, but the Dogman seemed to be able to keep up with him, and it didn't look like he was anywhere close to top speed yet. My father was cursing himself for not bringing his boss's arms with him, but I don't see how he could have fired that big old thing while driving anyway. I was far too young to have been able to do it, while both my mom and sister were by then in too much of a trance, staring at the wolfman, running next to us, as though they were seeing the most beautiful living thing on the planet. My father was almost flying off the road at turns, but he was clearly terrified of the Dogman and was willing to risk all our lives to get away from it. The Dogman seemed almost to sense this. I don't suppose he wanted us to all crash, because he stopped pursuing us. I remember looking out of the back of the car, seeing him standing up in the middle of the road, watching us drive away. Although Dad was shouting and cheering, declaring victory, I was wondering why the Dogman had decided to stop. He wasn't even winded. He could have kept chasing us for some time. The Dogman, to be honest, was acting more level-headed than my father was. At least, I thought so in that moment. After about a week at home, I noticed my sister sitting at a window in our house, just staring outside at the small woods that separated our place from our neighbor's property behind us. I was talking to her for a while before I noticed she wasn't answering me, and so I looked to see what she was staring at. It was that Dogman again, the one my mother kept calling handsome. It had figured out where we lived, and now it was back to staring at my sister. I told my parents, but this seemed to overwhelm them emotionally, and they kept telling me that what I was saying was impossible. They refused to come up to my sister's room and look out her window. They just didn't want to know, and they did not want to see. Misty left for college in the fall, and our neighbor tore up most of the trees between our properties. There was still a sort of natural fence line left, but not enough of a grove for a Dogman to hide out inside of. I never found out if that happened just randomly, or if the neighbor had been experiencing the Dogman back on that end of the property as well. In either case, the creature was not ever seen again by my family for the rest of the time that any of us lived there. Misty never moved back home. Instead, she went out west to study whatever nature courses people take when they want to become forest rangers. And that's what she is now, a forest ranger. Like I said, We don't argue anymore now that she's an adult, but she still gets testy and refuses to respond. Anytime I bring up that old Dogman, it seems odd to me that after so many years, she won't answer questions about that beast. She also never invited me or our parents to her place, and now both Mom and Dad are gone. Why is she so secretive? But really mainly about that one subject. I keep wondering how much Misty's life was changed because... The Dogman entranced my sister. My sister got too close to the Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story about the Dogman that deeply and negatively affected my family way back in the 20th century. I saw the creature multiple times myself. I saw it as a puppy, and I saw it as an adult. But after my sister Maggie disappeared, none of us ever saw that upright walking canine ever again. I used to live in Wisconsin with my mother, father, and sister who wasn't really named Maggie. Both of my parents have passed on since then, believing their daughter was no longer among the living. I suppose now they know the truth either way. I'm the only remaining member of my family, but I can't really know if I'm the last living one. I first encountered this particular Dogman in 1980, the same time my sister did. We were playing with some friends over at Cathedral Pines. Technically, Maggie was supposed to be watching me and my friends because she was 18 and we were 11 and 12, but I remember her spending the day playing alone with this really big brown and black puppy. I mean to say it looked and acted like a puppy, but it was already the size of an adult mid-sized dog. For instance, if that puppy were a beagle, it would already be an adult. The rest of us saw the puppy first because it came out of the woods to bark and growl at us younger kids. Then Maggie came over and pointed out that the oversized pup was wagging its tail while it barked at us. She explained that meant it was actually friendly, and then Maggie picked the big puppy up. It licked her all over her face, and she seemed to have proven her point. But when she held the young dog out for us to pet, it snapped at our fingers and made one of my friends cry. No matter what Maggie was trying to tell us, that dog only liked her and none of the rest of us. So we played our little kid games alone, and Maggie kept that dog occupied and away from the rest of us. About a half year later, we went back to that park, again with Maggie to act as our guardian. Once again, that dog ran out toward us, but this time it ran directly to Maggie, jumping up on her excitedly. This time when he did, he was pretty much as tall as Maggie herself, maybe even a little taller. I was stunned to be seeing this happen, but then I noticed that Maggie was not surprised at all. It was almost as though she expected to see the dog there. I began to think the situation through. Maggie had been missing from our home more than usual over the prior few months, but we all assumed she either had a new boyfriend or maybe a cocaine habit or something, and we really didn't think too much about it. I mean, it was 1980, but it could also have been possible that she might have been coming over here to Cathedral Pines State Natural Area and hanging out with her Dogman friend. Actually, I guess he wasn't a man yet, so maybe at that point he was a dog teen or something. The next time I saw him was only about 3 months later, but it seemed he might have hit his true adult height by then. I mean, when I saw the formerly cute puppy for the third time, I screamed, and I started blacking out. My body just didn't want to be there once the by then 12-foot-tall or taller monster thing crashed out of the woods and ran over, on 2 legs mind you, to my sister Maggie, who virtually disappeared under thick, massive, fur-covered canine appendages. He was hugging her, and I mean impossibly huge mongrel of some sort, was hugging my sister as though he were some kind of alternative human being. I plopped my butt on the grass and started breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth. It was a simplified form of meditation that I actually learned from my science teacher, and it kept me from completely blacking out. I had never noticed the dog walking on its hind legs that way before, so I was more than a little surprised at the incredible size that dog had grown to. Maggie told me afterward that he had always stood up and walked around since he was a pup. I guess I just never paid that much attention to the creature before. I made sure to stay out of its way so that I didn't get bitten. But once it became the truly giant size that this one had become, it was hard to notice anything other than that dog. You know, we never called it a dogman or a werewolf. We had seen it first as a dog, and as it became larger and larger, we still remembered it being a puppy. If it used to be a puppy, then it must now be a dog. I don't think I made the comparison to the legends of the Wisconsin werewolf until long after it was too late and Maggie was gone. Even though I was slow on the uptake in even noticing that this must have been a dogman that my sister was interacting with, I knew early on that she was getting herself into trouble. It was an upsetting feeling to figure out and get filled in by her, that she had been practically leading a double life, going to those same woods on her own and spending time playing with what she had to have known was a wild animal. That was not someone's pet puppy dog. It lived in the natural area. It clearly fed itself via hunting. This was not a safe playpen pal. This was a man-eating predator. I remember taking Maggie aside to try to get her to talk to our parents or our pastor or a guidance counselor or someone who might be able to help her out, at least more than I could. At first she got angry at me, taking offense to my implication that she needed help. But I really meant it. I was genuinely scared for her, and she was my sister. I didn't want to see her get hurt, and I thought she was making some mysteriously dangerous conclusions. I was only 14 at that point, I think, but I got her attention, and she seriously considered what I was talking to her about. Finally, she begged me to not tell our parents about it. That wasn't the answer I was hoping to get from her, but I agreed to keep quiet about her giant feral canine friend, who now walked up on his hind legs half the time. Maggie told me that the dog was still really mostly a dog, but it would stand up when it needed to. When she was around, he stood up like a human, and Maggie thought that meant he was just trying to be polite. He was trying to act like her, so that she would appreciate having him around. That was an age for Maggie to be socializing more. She was 18 or 19. That was why we didn't worry when we didn't see her around much. We thought she was out making friends and meeting people. But it turned out that all that time, she had been becoming increasingly isolated, neglecting her friends and family in favor of what I now understand had to have been a dogman. On the day when my sister disappeared, none of us noticed. The next morning we noticed, though. My mother called all of Maggie's friends that she knew of, but they all told similar stories. Maggie had been avoiding seeing anyone lately. She had missed out on parties and birthdays, and none of her friends really had any recent information about her at all. I knew that I had promised Maggie that I wouldn't reveal her secret, but I didn't think she ever foresaw anything like this happening. I decided to go talk to my parents and spill the beans on what I knew. I told them I thought Maggie was with this big dog, a dog that walked like a man, who we had met in Cathedral Pines. I told them that this giant dog was her only friend, and my father erupted. "Can't you see how upset your mother is? Don't you even care that your sister is missing?" Of course I cared. Why else would I be telling them all of this? My father dragged me to my room, shouting at me the entire way, as my mother sobbed loudly. I got locked in my room with no dinner for daring to tell them the truth about the dogman. Well, my input was no longer welcome in the family. I had become an only child, and the black sheep of the family, all in the exact same moment. Maggie disappeared in late 1980, early 1981, and that was the last anyone's seen of her. There's never been anything else found of her at all, so we don't know if she's still alive or not. The general presumption is that she is not, and we had services for her in 1987 or 88, if I'm remembering. Still, I sometimes wonder, did she run away with that immense beast? Could she still be with us somewhere, out there, in some forest somewhere? No matter what the true answer to that is, I can only state one thing for certain. My sister got way too close to the Dogman. I think Dogman fell in love with my sister. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I am of the opinion that most Dogman sightings are accidental, as in unintended by the beasts themselves. There are, however, rare cases of a Dogman seeming to reveal itself on purpose to various humans for various reasons. Maybe they just like scaring us, or possibly some of them hunt us for game. But maybe, once in a very long while, a feral Dogman may become fixated on a human being for reasons of affection, or possibly some mysterious sense of loyalty. I never saw any kind of cryptid until I got my first house in Mount Morris, which is in northern Wisconsin, less than 2 hours of driving from the majority of my family down in Madison. It was far enough away to keep them from wanting to visit me every day, but close enough that we could still see each other if and when we really wanted to. My family tended to be a bit clingy, but in this instance they came through strong, and they mostly left me alone for the first 3 to 6 months I was living on my own. I appreciated that because I guess I needed to prove to myself that I knew how to survive without the help of the rest of them. That's why when my sister Sandy came to visit 7 or 8 months into my stay in the new house, I was actually looking forward to seeing her. I had no idea that her visiting my part of the world would have such a drastic effect, altering the course of my life, her life, and the life of her husband, and eventually the child none of us yet knew she would soon be carrying within her. So Mount Morris is not exactly in the middle of the forest, although there is a forest in it. Also, the house I was in fact set back a bit behind some trees. When you were inside looking out, it sure did give the impression of being deep in the wilderness, but it really wasn't. Mostly, Mount Morris was known as a fun place to go, more than a nice place to live, but I loved it there. It was the only time I ever lived in the same town as a ski lodge, for one thing. I brought up the local enchanted forest, then changed the subject. Let's change it back. Mount Morris County Park, just south of Nordic Mountain Ski Park, is in fact quite heavily wooded. I don't really consider that a large enough woods to support a predator such as the Dogman, however. Perhaps I'm wrong in that assumption, as it was there that our sightings began. Since she was an outdoorsy type back in those days, Sandy and I decided to go for a hike in Mount Morris Park. It would give us a chance to catch up and tell each other what was new for us. There are a number of nice hiking trails in Mount Morris Park, so I chose one on a level I thought my sister could master. It turned out she found it easy, but I was the one huffing and puffing to keep up. It was starting to get dark, and I needed to sit and rest for a while before being ready to make it to the end of the trail so we could go get some dinner and go home. While I was sitting on some grass, being lectured by my sister about exercising and eating better, I thought I kept hearing things from one area in the woods. Sitting down as I was, I lacked the perspective to look over into that area. I felt worried, but even more than that, I felt exhausted. So I kept my butt on that grass, and I kept panting to get my strength back. Now, as I mentioned, I couldn't see into that area of the woods from my perspective, but Sandy could. I learned this after the next sound from that direction, the snapping of a twig or a branch, drew her attention. I studied her face as she reacted, at first with curiosity and interest, but then with a growing look of horror. Suddenly, my strength returned, and I bounced up, eager to see what had caused my sister to become so frightened. That was when I saw the hairy, upright humanoid canine retreating into the deeper woods, where we could no longer see him. My sister had been too stunned to say anything while the creature was looking at her, but when it walked away, she screamed in utter terror. She didn't scream any words, she just primal scream sort of screamed. She started running away, still shouting incoherently. I ran alongside her, not any less frightened than she was at the time. I had witnessed the side and the back of the creature briefly as it walked away. To me, it was a half-man and half-animal kind of a being. I had not seen its face, but I saw that it had a tail, so I knew it was not a Bigfoot. I don't remember how well I saw the legs that first time, but the tail told me it was not a Squatch. When talking to my sister after the danger was over, she told me it was a werewolf because it had a canine head. I didn't really understand what she meant at the time. I visualized something like the werewolves they used to have on TV, like in old black and white movies. The next time we were to see the creature, though, we both got a better look, and trust me, this was not a Lon Chaney kind of wolfman at all. Needless to say, that Dogman incident left us both very tired and very uncomfortable afterward. It certainly was not something that either of us had been prepared for, and so Sandy and I sort of neglected to stay in contact for a while. About 6 months later, the Dogman had become a topic of interest for my family, and so the sighting that Sandy and I had inspired various relatives to come visit me and stay overnight. Of course, none of them saw a Dogman, and neither did I. In my opinion at the time, the creature had just been wandering through the territory and randomly passed by my house. It seemed a 1 in a million chance that we saw him, and I was certain that would be the only cryptid sighting of my life. And then, Sandy came to visit again. It was around 7 or 8 months after that first crazy night, when she dropped by next to sleep over in my place and catch up on old times. I think the Dogman incident in the park had become just a story to both of us. It gave us a little bit of family celebrity, and it stopped seeming as scary as it faded into the rear-view mirror, figuratively speaking. Sandy and I had a fun evening that night, and then we hit the hay, and the Dogman was absolutely the last thing on my mind when Sandy's blood-curdling screams woke me up, sometime after 3 in the morning. I walked over to my sister's room, and I called out to her, but it seemed she was asleep. I went inside and turned on the light, waking her up from a bad nightmare. She sounded like she was being messed with by some kind of Freddy Krueger character. Her screams were so terrifying that my heart was beating really hard. You would have thought I was the one who had the nightmare. When we finally had both calmed each other down, I stood up to head back to my bedroom. As I flipped off her room light, however, we both saw it, outside her window. Once the room was darkened, it was slightly brighter outside than in, so we could see him standing right there. He wasn't visible when the overhead room lights had been shining, but now there he was. Clear as, well, not as clear as day, but as clear as the ambient lighting coming from the house and the moon could make him. So when Sandy had said it had a canine head, I didn't understand that she just literally meant it had a dog head. But that's what this creature or man had. I mean, its body looked like a man's body, but covered in fur like a bear. Its head was like the head of some sort of prehistoric cave wolf from the Ice Age. I don't remember if I made note of its paws, But that time I noticed its hind legs, the legs it was walking on, looked very much like thicker versions of the kinds of hind legs that most dogs have. This was the late 1980s, and I had not as of yet heard of Dogman, but I think that's what I saw. If it wasn't Dogman, then it was a werewolf, because it stood on its hind legs, was covered in fur, and had a head more like that of a wolf than that of a human being. It seemed as though the beast man had been standing there, holding onto a young sapling, and watching me and my sister talk inside the house. How long had it been there? Had it somehow caused Sandy's nightmare? Or was that a coincidence? When he saw us looking back at him, or perhaps when he couldn't see us so clearly any longer, I saw the most annoyed expression on his face. Then I watched him casually turn and walk back past the dark tree line, where we couldn't see him any longer. I wasn't really sure if he had moved on, or if he had only backed up to change the place he was watching us from. I pulled the shade shut, and the two of us discussed what had just happened. After some conversation, I moved Sandy upstairs to another room I was using for storage that had a folding bed in it. The only window in there was well up off the ground, and she said she felt safer. The next morning over breakfast, we both felt a pretty strong conviction that the creature had come again because she was there. This time, we made plans for her to test this theory by coming back a few days after that second sighting. Well, I'll tell you, he wouldn't stop mooning over her. I did not see or hear the beast during Sandy's absence, but the night she came back for a third visit, so did he. When we were younger, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, and Sandy used to play some other kind of fantasy role-playing game with her friends. Her character had a wolf familiar in her game, and she named it Arshama. Sandy told me she had a dream about this NPC the night before, and that she had been wondering if the Dogman was part of her imagination being projected outward, like a tulpa. We had a quiet night, and we went to bed early. Again, I was awakened after 3 a.m., this time to use the restroom, when I heard my sister chanting upstairs in that converted storeroom. I climbed those stairs to pay her a visit. I found her sitting cross-legged on a chair by the lone window in the room, glancing down at my backyard and chanting Arshama's name over and over. When I came into the room, she smiled up at me and told me I had missed him. The Dogman had been downstairs in the yard, howling up at her window. That might have been what actually woke me up in the first place, although I have no memory of hearing howling, so maybe not. Sandy told me she stared down at it through the window, standing broad-shouldered like a young warrior. Although we had both seen that the beast man stood well over 6 feet tall, Sandy insisted that it was a young man of his species, venturing away from his tribe for the first time, looking for prey, and looking for a mate. For some reason, he had become fixated on her. So our experiment seemed to prove without a doubt that the Dogman was only interested in Sandy. We resolved that from then on, I would go to visit her, as it was no longer safe enough for her to visit me. We weren't happy about it, but at least we were putting a stop to this growing problem. And then, the Dogman followed her home from my place. This time Sandy didn't even see it, but her husband sure did. He called me up, cursing a blue streak and blaming me for the entire situation. He was, and is, a big man, and I was unhappy having him angry at me. Sandy admitted to me that she actually almost liked the attention the Dogman paid her in the beginning. It was nice to have someone making her husband work harder to protect her. Besides, it does sound like a Beauty and the Beast scenario. Who wouldn't want a mythical, magical, and possibly supernatural animal man loyally protecting them for life? It's just that this particular bow wow was too close in form to a human male to remain content sleeping on the floor next to the bed for very long. It was too dangerous a kind of affection to mess around with, and Sandy and her husband were smart enough to realize this. Sandy soon found herself expecting a child, and that solidified her and her husband's decision to make a break for it, create a new life in another location. When a job opportunity in another state arose for hubby, the chance to get away completely from the Dogman presented itself, and the two of them took that chance. Once Sandy decided to move, her front porch became a daily yard sale. She and her husband sold everything they didn't ship ahead or carry with them onto the plane, thereby depositing items with her scent on them all around Wisconsin and beyond. Whatever couldn't be sold or given away was trashed or left behind for the next owners, as Sandy took off by jet to a very different part of the country, never to return. Her line of thinking was that even the great Dogman shouldn't be able to sniff out which direction an airplane flew in. To be honest, although I loved the area, I soon moved to be closer to a person I was having a relationship with at the time. Since then, I've mostly lived in more suburban areas, more densely populated. It creeped me out when I thought back on all these events I've just described to you. I mean, the only way the Dogman could have known when my sister was nearby was if he was also nearby. I don't think he traveled far to my house when she came over. I think he could smell when she entered our part of the world, and that he was always there, whether she was or not. The only difference was that when Sandy came by, the Dogman would reveal himself to her and anyone else who happened to be there. When she went away, I think the only thing that changed was that he stopped showing himself to me. Until he followed her home, that is, obviously. I'm sad she had to move away, and I feel badly about my role in all of that. But I think she and her husband made the wisest decision, as none of us have seen any Dogman again since then. For those of you who would criticize my sister or her husband for what they did, keep in mind that you should walk a mile in the other person's moccasins before judging them. Unless it's happened to you, you're not going to really understand what it felt like when... Dogman fell in love with my sister.
Find that link in the description, honey.
My sister is too close to that Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a problem with my sister Amelia, who listens to your channel. She thinks that Dogman are her friends, thanks to your programming. And she's gotten too close with a creature that I suspect might actually be a demon from hell. I ask that you please read my email on your show in order to present a more balanced view of this subject. I don't know if there are actually nice Dogmen or werewolves as your show seems to assert, but I do know that not all of them are to be trusted. I feel a deep sense of guilt about this because I'm the one who first told her about the Dogman. I was listening to a few different channels on YouTube that talked about it, and I was very interested in the subject back then. We live in Wisconsin, and so that made it local and personal. She started listening also, but I found that she preferred your channel, with ladies talking about how nice dogmen are to them. I don't want to insult you or the people who send you their stories, but I'm not so sure that all of them are really true. Could wild animals actually be so friendly? I find it doubtful. And the other side of it that I hate to admit is that some dogmen seem to be supernatural or paranormal in some way. I would never have accepted that concept before, but because of the things I'm about to tell you, I feel that now I'm forced to at least consider the possibility of such things. People mean different stuff when they use woo-woo terms like paranormal and supernatural. But when I use terms like that in this email, I'm referring to events and creatures that I am sure have a natural and a logical explanation. It's just that it's an explanation that our species is not sufficiently evolved to understand just yet. Because there are parts of what I'm about to dive into that don't really fully make sense, even to me. So let's get started. My sister and her girlfriends have always been into the Ouija board, since they were in, I think, 2nd or 3rd grade. I know a lot of people have problems with Ouija boards. Well, get ready, because this story is the reason I now don't like the things. I do admit that when I was a kid, I was fascinated by the Ouija board. After all, nothing else that came in a box from Parker Brothers Games claimed that it could speak to the deceased. That's a pretty unique marketing position within the gaming industry, as my dad used to say. My mom used to have weekly Ouija board meetings with a group of her friends. Once a month it was at our house, and it seemed as though the events usually drew 8 to 10 women. There was a core group of, I guess, 5 regulars, and a cast of rotating extras, depending on the season. Some women only seemed to show up immediately after losing a relative or pet, to seek consolation from the other side. It was always a lot more interesting than my mother's monthly bridge meetings, which usually dissolved into an argument for whatever reason. I still don't even know what the rules of bridge are, but I heard all sorts of strange messages coming from that Ouija. There just wasn't as much entertainment going around for free back then, so there was no way I would miss listening in from the staircase when it was my mom's Ouija board night. It was condoned in our house, and so Amelia would do the Ouija thing with her friends, usually asking it questions about boys. So back during the pandemic, Amelia started to meet in the woods with her friends to do the Ouija because somehow they thought it would be healthier or some nonsense. But when they started to do it out there, she started to come home with stories of nature spirits talking to them and giving them advice about school and about boys. My mom was like, oh sure, that makes sense. But I was like, nature spirits? And I decided to tag along on her next Ouija board session. The girls made me sit on the grass at least 6 feet away from the 4 of them, as they sat on 2 rocks, looking ridiculous wearing surgeon's masks on a hot summer day in the woods. They soon started getting responses from something that claimed to be the spirit of the woods. I was sitting on the ground as they forced me to do, and from my vantage point, I could see what looked like an animal face peering out of the darkness at the girls. His face was directly over my sister's face from my vantage point. It was such a bright day, and the monster's face was in dark shadow, so I couldn't be certain that it wasn't pareidolia. I kept staring and squinting my eyes at it, trying to understand what I was seeing. But then there was a sound of a stick snapping, and for just a moment, the face appeared in much more direct sunlight. For 1 second or 2, I saw a big monster face with tall, terrifying-looking monster teeth, and tall, pointed dog ears up on top of his massive cranium. I wasn't the only one who saw him, as the girl sitting directly across from my sister screamed. and fell backward off the rock she'd been sitting on. She and I started running away from there, soon joined by the other girls, all running back toward my family's house. When we reached our family's backyard, however, there was no sign of my sister Amelia. I told the girl who had seen what I saw to go inside and report all the details to my mother, and I tore off into the woods to find what happened to Amelia. When I found her, I didn't exactly run over to hug her. Instead, I ducked down behind some bushes and I watched, because she appeared to be communicating in some way with the creature thing whose face had caused us to run. This thing was even larger than I could have imagined, and it was literally down on its knees to try to get closer to my sister's size. It was making itself small, and the two of them were looking at each other in the way people do when having a conversation. The thing is, their lips weren't moving, and they weren't making any sounds as far as I could hear. They appeared to be occasionally shifting positions slightly, but keeping their eye contact locked. They wouldn't look away from each other. It seemed as if the thing might be mesmerizing or hypnotizing my sister in some weird way. It did have the tall, pointed dog ears that one might expect to see on a Dogman, but the face was taller and not as elongated as I might have thought it would be. I mean, this wasn't a Bigfoot. They don't have ears like a German Shepherd. It wasn't furry all over, but where it did have hair, it was long and straggly. It was a very muscular thing with so little body fat that at points I wondered if I were looking at exposed muscle with no skin at all over it. I wondered what my sister thought she was looking at, and how closely it did or didn't resemble what I was seeing. Maybe it was the way its ears were positioned, almost like horns on its head. But I thought this thing was a demon from the first second I saw it. If it wasn't, then it was a Dogman who had seen his better days pass him by. This guy looked in bad shape. That's what I'm trying to say here. Eventually, the Beastman sort of stood up suddenly, in this manner that looked very unnatural to me. I don't even know how to explain it. It was like his personal physics were different from the physics that the rest of us use. Of course it was dark, and I might have been imagining things in the night. Nothing about this seemed okay to me though. After the devil Dogman sort of melted backward into the darkness, Amelia started walking back toward home, and I intercepted her, asking all sorts of questions. She told me that the two of them had just had a conversation, and I informed her that neither of them had opened their mouths, that neither of them had uttered one single word. She laughed and said that wasn't true. The two of them had just talked up a storm. She seemed to think they had a normal conversation, chatting in English. I saw with my own eyes that this was not the case, and I tried to explain that to her. Amelia seemed too blissed out to care what I was saying to her, though, and she kept laughing a lot, as though the things I was saying were funny. When we got back inside, our friends and my mother were there to greet Amelia with even more questions. She told them that she had a conversation with a Dogman, same as she told me. I told them that I watched the entire thing, and she never said a word. She just stared into the creature's eyes. My mother said, "Oh, then it was a psychic conversation, as though that were the most normal and typical thing in the world." I had half a dozen red flags going off about various aspects of all of this, but whenever I tried to raise any of my concerns, my mother downplayed them and just wanted to hear Amelia's side of it. And according to Amelia, she had met a wonderful new friend. She now knew a dogman who was sweet and kind and loving. When I interrupted to say that he looked emaciated and sickly, my mother said, "Beauty is in the eye of the beholder." And then she sent me to the store to buy her some incense, just to remove me from the conversation. So I found out that Amelia had become a big fan of your channel, and I think that's why she thought the Dogman was her friend. Or at least it helped her to get suckered in by this thing that I think is a demon. I don't think it's even a Dogman at all, just something that can make itself look sort of like one. Amelia and my mother and I eventually got into a big shouting match about all of this. I challenged Amelia to ask the Dogman what he was. Ask him to tell her if he was a demon or not. She agreed that she would go and ask him just that. Well, I followed her from behind where she couldn't see, and Amelia went back to those same rocks in the woods. And the beast came forth out of the woods just as before. It was something even more frightening to me that second time. There was no more debating or arguing about it. There was the creature. It was real, and it was horrible to see. When Amelia got back home, she admitted that the Dogman had told her it was from hell. But she only did so in passing as she went on to make what to her were more important points. Like that the Dogman didn't want to be from hell, and he didn't want to be a demon. Amelia was advising the demon to stop identifying as a demon, and to pick something nicer to identify as. I rolled my eyes and asked how she couldn't see that she was being mind-gamed and messed with. My mother told me to be quiet, and asked Amelia what else the wise dog-headed man told her. The two of them looked so unintelligent to me in that moment. The demon gave them a sob story about how he didn't want to be a demon, and it flattered their egos. People get stupid when you flatter their ego, it seems. Good thing I'm already too much of an egomaniac for anyone to even be able to puff it up any larger. When people compliment me, I correct them to make the compliments bigger. So when I looked at that wolfman thing, I was seeing something a lot closer to what it really was than what my sister was seeing, or than my mother would even want to see. My mother hasn't seen your channel, but she's been wanting to get some sort of magical friend or familiar all her life. If she has to live through Amelia to get it, that's fine with her. So any warning signs that I pointed out that maybe making friends with a dog-headed beast man who admits he comes from hell itself might have negative repercussions were blocked out just the same as though they were actual facts trying to get into a publication like the New York Times. Nobody wanted to hear the truth. They only wanted their fantasy reinforced. I became very unpopular because I was so married to reality, and they found my presence annoying. Things degenerated from there, as Amelia brought her friends to the woods to be transfixed by this dogman. They each bring him offerings now. They each devote parts of their weeks performing services that he requests of them. More and more of their time is occupied doing things that seem to make no sense to anyone but the dogman. I understand why he asked them for food, but why does he ask them to spin in a circle 3 times before presenting him with the food? I think the point of the rituals he gives them is just to reinforce that he can get them to do any silly thing that he wants them to do. He doesn't really need any more reason than that. Just keep them used to following orders without thinking. They all tell me his sob stories, how hard his life is, how much he wants to be a good creature. None of them mention that he used to claim to be the innate spirit of the woods. After I said he was a demon, then he admitted he was from hell. They act like his story never changed. We know for a fact that he is a liar. We just don't really know for certain what any truth about him is. We can only guess about that, which is why my sister and her friends need to get away from him before it's too late. Instead, it seems to be the opposite that's happening. Two of Amelia's friends have parents who are fine with all of this. Only one hides this information from her mother. I mean, think about that. We're talking about going on trips into the woods to talk with a straggly-haired thing that admits it comes up from hell to meet with those girls. Since this began, I've started to go to church on Sundays. My family thinks that's hysterically funny, but I don't want to lose my soul. I'm not even really sure what a soul is, but something deep down tells me I'm going to want mine intact on the inevitable day I meet my maker. I've got myself a job in town, and I made friends with a girl who lives near my job. Sometimes she even lets me stay over at her place. I don't want to admit it to her, but I'll tell you outright. I'm kind of afraid to go home to my family anymore. They seem to think all of this is me overreacting, but I kind of think they are missing the point. Heck, they're missing a whole handful of points. Last night I woke up with that feeling that I was being watched. I got up to go to the bathroom, and as I was walking out, from the darkest corner of my room behind the door, sprang the form of a hairy man-like beast with fur in spots, but mange in others. It leaped out of the opened window that I had shut and locked earlier. As it exited and ran off, it appeared to me to be much larger outside than it had when it was inside. In fact, there was no way that the huge Dogman creature that I saw running off could have fit through the opening in my window that I saw it or something jump through. It did happen fast, and everybody I tell about this says it was a trick of light and shadow. But I woke up feeling watched, and then I saw a bipedal shadowy creature leap out of the corner of my room and through my window out into the yard behind my house. And then I saw that same Dogman that my sister feels sorry for, and he was running away. I feel like the two were the same thing, but I do admit that it might be possible that those were two different creatures and that I put them together in my mind in the dark. But if that's the case, then where did the smaller one go after he jumped out of the window? Why didn't I see two of them running away? It really felt like that thing somehow unlocked my window, or maybe hypnotized my sister into unlocking it, then climbed in and sat in the dark in my room, watching me sleep. I mean, I was about to leave the room to go to the bathroom when it leaped out of the shadows. If it had just sat still, it could have either left after I was gone, or waited for me to come back so it could stare at me some more. Running just when it did makes me ask if it wanted me to see it. It's possible that it was just stupid though, I guess. It was one or the other. So I think you can understand why I feel unsafe in that house. Because I am unsafe in that house. I'm saving up my money now and I'm praying that I can find a roommate situation sooner rather than later. I'm 18, so I'm an adult. If I don't like it in that house, I can leave as soon as I can afford it. So that is what I'm trying to do. And I'm trying to do that because my sister is too close to that Dogman. My sister's boyfriend is a werewolf. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I know that you won't believe me, but this happened to me personally the other evening as sunset ended. I was in the woods behind my family's house, a couple of minutes walk into the trees, and I was enjoying watching the light get darker and darker. I know it's unsafe to be in the woods at night, but I grew up in this house and I've never encountered anything bigger than a stray house cat in those backwoods. I should say I never did before this night I'm telling you about, at least. I was walking on a narrow dirt path and entertaining lazy thoughts about going home soon when the crashing of leaves somewhere in front of me captured all of my attention. For the first time I can ever remember, I felt frightened in that small forest behind my family home. It seemed like an irrational fear at the time, but I ducked behind a large tree and peeked out, even as I felt stupid doing so. It was probably one of my neighbors. I had run into neighbors in those woods more times than I could count on one hand, and I never felt frightened when any of them approached. I began thinking about possibly jumping out and shouting boo when I saw whoever it was. Except that I never saw who it was. I saw what it was. A savage-looking mess of a thing, that's what it was. Something down on all fours, yet still standing 5.5 or 6 feet tall at the shoulder by my estimate. It was barreling through the undergrowth at a rate twice that of any human being, and yet I got the impression that the thing wasn't at all in any kind of a hurry. And then, suddenly, it stopped short, and it tensed up. I saw it move its head around, sniffing the air and moving its tall, thin ears around on the top of its head, like it was using them for echolocation or something. I felt a cold breeze at my back blowing the smell of my fear directly into the thing's nostrils. He was using all his senses to triangulate my position, and it was only a matter of time until he was going to roust me out. I shivered all over. I didn't know what that thing would do to me once it found me, and I thought about making a run for it back to the house. That was when fate sort of decided things for me, as I watched while that creature leaned back and stood up on its hind legs. Imagine a werewolf, but in real life. That was what I felt like I was seeing. Its front paws were like monster claws, not dog paws. The fur was long and wavy, colored this very unique orangey-reddish color with lighter streaks running through it around the edges. It was unforgettable looking, with its very beautiful but very conspicuous markings. Certainly if this creature wanted to be camouflaged, he'd need to stay near autumn leaves, as nothing else in nature is ever so brightly orange and red as this upright, wide-chested dog or dogman was. I felt like I was looking at a special effects movie, but one of the older ones where it's all practical effects. This didn't look like it was generated in a computer. It looked like some kind of giant Jim Henson puppet from hell, towering probably over 10 feet tall, surveying the area, trying to sniff me out. The problem with this description, though, is that a puppet that large would need multiple puppeteers, and it would need to move a little on the slow side. This giant upright dog thing moved fast, sort of like it had too much coffee for breakfast or something. It looked around fast. It moved its ears fast. It sniffed the air and it panted fast. And I knew that if I ran away, it would run after me fast as well. But it was either that, or wait for him to come get me. So I decided to take the squirrel path back. Squirrel Path was a smaller, narrower, shorter path back that required crawling at points and squeezing through some closely packed trees. My sister and I used to race each other in timed races when we were younger. Take the main path to the crooked tree, then come back on the squirrel path. If I was lucky, I could scoot through there in places too small for the dogman to fit. And if I was unlucky, then I'd get stuck somewhere and be easy pickings for the dogman. I counted down in my head. 3, 2, 1, run. As soon as I took off, the dogman emitted a high-pitched, nervous, and angry sort of barking, and I could hear the giant thing racing after me. I ran that natural obstacle course like I had never run it in my life, and it sounded as though the dogman were getting further and further away from me. When I came up behind the house, though, I saw the dogman already emerging from the bushes in front of me to the right on the main path. I was too late. He was going to be able to cut me off, and I was too exhausted to run any further. I held onto a tree and braced for impact, my eyes tearing up because I was feeling pretty emotional. But the Dogman surprised me. Instead of turning left and nabbing me, he raced around the right side of the house, disappearing from view on the other side, and apparently heading out toward the sidewalk in the front of the house. I wanted to drop to the floor and faint in relief, but curiosity kept me moving toward the house, heading in the back door, with the intent of looking out the front windows to see if I could see where the Dogman went. Once I got inside, though, I saw my sister introducing my parents to an individual I had never seen before in my life. Or had I? There was a very tall young gentleman there, a rugged-looking individual. The guy had long, wavy, bright orange hair with lighter-colored streaks in it. My knees almost gave out when I made the connection, and I retreated out of the house before the guy could see me. I stood out back, thinking for a while. Seriously, WTH is about all my brain could give back to me, though. I went and hid around the side of the house behind a bush with a view of the front door. I wondered, if that guy was the Dogman, the werewolf, was he going to attack my family? Should I call the police on my cell? If so, what should I tell them, that I think my sister invited a werewolf over? I really didn't know what I should do, but I knew I was really scared that streaky dude was going to turn back into the wolfman while inside my house. I was shaking all over. I was genuinely terrified and confused. When the front door opened, I was somewhat relieved to see polite smiles on everyone's faces. Where was this guy going to take my sister for their date? Was he going to throw her on his back and race off on all fours? He had gotten there through the woods. I saw him. I watched as my parents waved and the two of them hopped on the Harley that had been parked out front all morning. I presume he drove it there earlier and left it? I had seen the bike there since breakfast, and I know it had never been parked on our block before. We're the only house on that block, so it's extremely rare to see a Harley parked out front. Nevertheless, I seem to have been the only one who took mental note of the motorcycle for some reason. I watched the two of them drive off, and it left a bad taste in my mouth. I usually get along with my sister's boyfriends, but this guy just chased me through the woods and had me convinced I was a goner. I can't imagine that my sister isn't in serious danger hanging around this guy. If I said that to her, I'm sure it would only make her like the guy better. If she gets harmed or worse, though, I could never forgive myself. So I wish I knew what to do about the fact that my sister's boyfriend is a werewolf. Don't go anywhere. We've got a second Wintertime Dogman story in a minute, but first please allow me to deeply thank a very kind gentleman named Timothy Walker, our executive producer for tonight's episode. Our executive producer is Timothy Walker. He heats the room like Betty Crocker. He's more OG than Knickerbockers because Mr. Walker is a real punk rocker. Please join me in thanking Timothy Walker, who recently upgraded to our $10 level channel membership. He's so cool, he already got to see this episode yesterday. And you could too if you join our $10 level by clicking the join link under this video. Thanks, Tim. We really appreciate it. And now, here's that second Wintertime Dogman story I promised you. And this one is called Dogman and the Icy Day. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I went for a walk alone in nature, which is something I don't think I'd ever do again. I got my ankles stuck in some ice, and I couldn't get away when I got sighted and approached by a Dogman. This story happened in Superior National Forest, up about as north as you can go in Minnesota without becoming a Canadian. It was late December in 2012, and I was camping in the snow with my crazy camping buddy that we can call Bluto. Although he's calmed down a bit more recently since he got married, Bluto was, when we first met, a real-life version of the John Belushi character in Animal House. He was chubby and round, but insane and manic. He could outrun me, and even though I'm taller and I work out, I'm pretty sure he could take me in a fight, even these days. It was always a lot of fun hanging around with him, but I would also need breaks. and it was on one of my Bluto breaks that I nearly lost my life to the North American upright walking canid, or Dogman. I remember it was so peaceful walking in the snow that evening that I began to feel at home out there in the wilderness. That's very unwise. The wilderness is not my home. And so I got careless, walking while looking off in the distance and admiring the view, instead of watching where I was placing my boots. I slid off a sheet of ice I should have seen, and I slid sideways down an incline, screaming because I thought I was going to fall 100 feet or more. It was only around an 8 or 9 foot drop as I fell into a tiny little ravine and landed hard on more ice underneath me, which shattered, lowering me suddenly about another 8 or 9 inches. It was like, bump, bump, oops. I was so relieved not to be plummeting to a horrible demise that I started laughing at myself for screaming. I reached up and I could feel the root of a large and solid tree. I'd be able to pull myself up out of that hole no problem. Relaxing, I resolved to catch my breath and wait until my heart stopped beating so hard. I was stuck in an icy hole a foot or so over my head, feeling stupid and ridiculous, but otherwise fine. When I was ready, I reached up, grabbed that big old root, and began pulling myself up, only to have my attempt thwarted by an icy stabbing pain in my right ankle. Giving up, I squatted straight down as there really wasn't room to bend over. It was hard to see from my angle, but my hands confirmed that my right foot had fallen through some ice, and the way the fallen ice had collapsed around my ankle, I was unable to lift my foot back out. This was a scary situation to be sure, but at that point, I was still mostly feeling embarrassed for having been so out of it that I got myself into this stupid situation. I started pressing my hands against the ice to try to move it. That wasn't happening, but I noticed my hands were getting wet, which had to mean that the ice was melting due to the warmth of my ankle and my hands. I had no choice but to try to melt enough of the ice away that my foot could come free. Then it would be easy to climb out. I discovered that my hands were freezing up faster than the ice was melting, and I had to stick my hands in my pants repeatedly to warm them up again. I was feeling stupider and stupider, but I still wasn't thinking that this was the end of me. Squatting down in the hole, trying to melt the ice around my ankle with my bare hands, I began to hear this sort of Darth Vader kind of sound up above me. Like a really heavy, raspy breathing. It sounded like a really big guy with asthma who was sort of panting loudly. The sound got louder and louder, and I thought it might be my buddy Bluto, so I called out his name. I heard a shuffling sound as whoever it was came closer quickly, and soon I looked up to see a big, old, giant dog head looking down at me, with drool landing all over my face from way up there, about 5, 6, 7 feet above me. Again, I laughed in relief, thinking that there was no reason to be afraid. After all, it was just a big old pooch. I stood up quickly, reaching up to pet the head of the dog, and also to warm my hands on him while I was at it. As I rose up, I saw the dog's expression change drastically. Rather than reaching up and petting his head, that dog head rose up into the air faster than my hand rose to greet it. The unexpectedness of this took my breath away. At first I thought I was seeing someone tall grabbing the dog by its collar and lifting it up quickly. This dog wasn't wearing any collar, though. The lips curled back, and that dog, standing there on its hind legs, began barking at me in this furiously angry way, with growling in between each bark. My eyes refocused on him, looking at him all over again. This time, I wasn't seeing him as a dog. This seemed like a wild animal, something more wolf than pooch. Also, it was reared upright as it barked at me, looking downward. I had made it feel threatened when I reached out to touch it, and it had stood up in response. Now I was prey, trapped in a hole. Prey that had gotten the predator frightened and upset. My blushing intensified, but this time it wasn't because I was worried about Bluto making fun of me. This time it was because I realized I might be about to make my curtain call because of my own carelessness and stupidity. Each time the upright wolf barked at me, it felt almost like being hit from above. That's how percussive his shouting was. It was like being scolded before being eaten for dinner. I was crying and wishing for him to get it over with. But then I realized the Dogman was probably waiting for me to climb up. There wasn't really room for him to jump down with me. He might have been able to reach me with his long front legs, but he wasn't thinking like a man. He was thinking like an upright walking wolf. He wanted to snap at me with his jaws. That's what his instincts told him was right. At least that's what I was hoping. I felt kind of in a mild shock. Between that and the ice, I was shivering all over. As soon as I saw that dog rear up, it felt like all the blood had drained from my body. I was ice cold everywhere but my flushed cheeks and forehead. After a while, I gave up on the ice around my ankle and worked on warming my fingers back up instead. The dog barked and growled, and growl barked, and bark growled over me, causing me physical pain and a mounting headache. I remembered one time when I stayed at my cousin's place in Brooklyn for a month that almost every day this one car alarm would go off and keep going off for an hour. Maybe it wasn't a car, but it was some kind of an alarm, and it was loud. It drove me crazy when I got there, and it made it hard for me to get my work done. By the time I left, though, I had worked out a way to block it out using meditation. I tried using the same technique to relax myself and endure the loud and angry monster a few feet above me. It worked to some extent, but a car alarm doesn't have fangs the size of the ones that heinous beast above me that night did. I went from attempted meditation to attempted praying as I became more and more convinced that I wasn't going to get out of this in one piece. Even if the Dogman went away, I might get frostbite. I might pass away from exposure to the elements. Maybe I'd starve to death. Maybe they'd never find me in my little hidey hole, even if the Dogman left me alone. But the Dogman wasn't leaving me alone. It kept shouting and moaning and whining and growling at me relentlessly. And then I heard a sound even more feral and crazy than the most insane Dogman. I heard some kind of a caveman screaming, and I looked up to see that Dogman looking scared for about 1/20th of a second before he split. I could hear the thing running away loudly, and I could hear the screaming caveman monster sound getting closer. I'll tell you, I thought I was witnessing a Dogman being chased off by a Bigfoot, because that's what it sounded like. I wasn't far off, though. It was my friend Bluto. He was absolutely plastered, and he was laughing his butt off. I could barely understand what he was saying, but I don't think he understood that he just chased off a real Dogman. He kept shouting after the monster, calling him a freak and a pervert and a cosplayer. So I don't really know what he was seeing through his beer goggles that night. All I know is that he thought it was hysterical that my foot was stuck in ice and that I was in a hole. He tossed me a 50-cent lighter, and I began working on the ice a bit. He left, and then he staggered back a few minutes later with a small hammer that he had brought with his supplies. That finished the job of freeing me from my icy prison. I would have felt extremely humiliated being out-survivored by my comedy relief drinking buddy, but I was so overcome with emotion about the Dogman incident that I just limped to my tent, and I called it a night. I cried myself to sleep like a lady in an old romance novel. So upsetting had my experience been. After all, I thought I wasn't going to make it out. I thought the Dogman was going to finish me off. The next day, Bluto didn't remember any of this, nor did he believe anything I said when I tried to tell him about Dogman and the icy day.
Hey, do any of you like these adult coloring books or digital coloring books? I've heard that some people like them, so I made this one. You can print them out and color them by marker or crayon, or you can color them digitally in whatever manner it is that people do things like that. No, I did not draw these images. I'm the editor and the archivist. The price is $209 for over 60 images of scary dogmen and werewolves. We got werewolves chasing ladies. This guy here is running from a werewolf that already bit off half of one of his arms, it looks like. It's a crazy and fun wild time. I guess you can judge for yourself if it's good for kids. I don't know. I don't have kids myself, so I can't really tell you. I know I would have liked it when I was young, but I don't know if that counts because I was a weird kid. Anyway, the link is in the description and the pinned comment, so check it out if you'd like to. Since it's digital, you can actually get it on Christmas Day as a last-minute present.
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.